Hey there, today we're going to be talking about some fun and easy style enhancements that we can add to our web pages. So we're going to look at a little bit of CSS, tiny little bit of JavaScript, and just some basic guidelines for design. All right, what we're going to do to this page right here. Right now it's an okay page. We've got a header area with a big title. There's this nice big attractive image for the header, and then the content for a page. Now what we're going to do, these are the things right here, we're going to apply the rule of thirds to the design. So I'll show you how that can be done quite simply. We're going to look at the golden ratio, Phi, and see how we can apply that to our design. We're going to animate the header image. So this one right here, we're going to make this, use the transform scale to animate when the page loads. And then the last one is, we're going to look at using some CSS variables, and we're going to show you how to set those. I'm going to show you how to set those from JavaScript. So let's jump right in here, and we'll start looking at the rule of thirds first. So this is something that you'll hear about a lot when they talk about photography and video. When you're taking a picture, you want to break your content up into three areas. So the top third, the middle third, the bottom third, or left and right, 1, 2, 3, 3 columns. And we're going to be trying to put the area of interest inside of sort of one of those central things. You don't want the main focal point to be up here, or if there's multiple elements, you're going to fit them into those thirds. You want to be able to break the picture up. So we're going to do it with this right here, this header bar. We're going to have this occupying the middle third of the page, regardless of the orientation, regardless of the screen size. We're going to make sure our background image fills the space, and this heading bar is going to be the middle third. All right, so in the HTML, we have header with an H1 element. So in our CSS, here's our header, here's our H1. And what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to take this thing and we're going to move it down. We want to have it centered vertically. So step one, we'll take the header element itself and set this to display flex, and our flex direction is going to be a column. And that's what's going to allow us to center this thing vertically using place content. We'll set that to center. So with just that, we've moved this thing down from the top down here into the middle. So regardless of the size of this browser, it's going to be in the middle of this space. So my image fills up the whole screen, and that title bar is going to be in the center. Now it is only occupying as big as the text is, so I'm going to bump this up to have it fill the actual middle third there. So we can jump down now into the H1 element itself, and we're going to make it have a height of 33 VH. So 33% of the viewport height. Great. So the white partially transparent bar is now filling a third. So I've got 3 horizontal bars here. Now my text itself, that's not centered yet. To fix that, we can just use the same thing that we were doing here, display flex. There we go. So by making it a column, we're centering it vertically with justify content here. So that was pretty simple. We just broke this up into thirds, centered it vertically, and then the content inside of here, we centered that vertically as well. That's the rule of thirds. You can do that horizontally, you can do it vertically, you can turn things into a grid and space them out evenly that way. Simple, simple, simple. Okay, moving on to our next one here, the golden ratio. Well, the golden ratio, or Phi, is a percentage. If you take any element, you can cut it into 2 parts. One which is 62.8% and the other is 38.2%. And anything broken down in this ratio tends to be very pleasing to the eye. Like, it's not an absolute rule, it's a guideline, but it's something that's very easy to implement. So what I'm going to do in here is I'm going to actually change this. So I'm going to take my 38%, it's going to cut it off around here, and I'm going to make this part have a black background, and I'm going to keep the white background for this side. So we'll quickly jump into our H1 element again, and all we're going to do is add border left. Now we've got box sizing on all the elements. Right here, box sizing set to border box, so that means that the width will include the size of the border. So whatever I set the border to right here, the width, the entire width of the thing is going to include that amount of border. So 38.2 of the viewport width. That is how wide this is going to be. I'm going to make it solid, and I'm going to make it black with the same alpha transparency as I have right here. So hue doesn't really matter. Saturation, 0, so there's no color. The lightness, instead of 100%, it's going to be 0, which will make it black. And then we'll use 0.8, so 80% as well. And there we have it. So the 38.2. And those are the two numbers that you can use. And you can use it with the with calc. In CSS, we've got that numerical function called calc, so you can take any number and multiply it by these. But this is the ratio, 38.2 to 62.8. Now, the numbers are much longer, but that is a good approximation for them. Okay, so we have rule of thirds. We've got the golden rule, the phi, applied into here. Now, if you want to carry that down, if we want to add some visual interest to the rest of the page as well, instead of it just being a stack of content, just one big column of content, which that can work on a mobile device when you've got limited horizontal space. This is the layout that you're going to have. But on larger screens, when you get up above 6, 8, 900 pixels, at that point, you do really want to start working with columns and other things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this main element and I'm going to add a margin on the left-hand side, which is going to match this. So my content is going to follow this line down the page. So right here, my main element, this is my default amount of padding. I've got padding of 2 REMs on each side. But I'm going to say, I'm going to set a media query where if my width is greater than, I'm just going to say 700 pixels, then my new style for main, padding is still going to be 2 REM on the top, right, and bottom. But on the left side, I don't need any extra space. The space is going to be created by my margin. So my margin left is going to be same as this. This is the value I'm going to use right here. And now I have this interesting line. It's not an even division, so there is some visual interest. It's asymmetrical. It's an asymmetrical layout where we've got the 38% is sort of empty here and all the content is shifted over here. And this is going to work because I'm working with percentages at any size layout. My image, I'm using background size cover, so it fills the whole space. But I have this sort of offset feel to it. Okay, so that's our rule of thirds. We've got the golden ratio applied. Now, animating the header image. What I'm going to do here is something that I've done many times, in that I'm going to wait until everything is loaded. And then that's the trigger. Once everything is loaded, my fonts, my images, all those things, once they're loaded, that's the load event. And that is going to be my trigger to add something to the page. And it's going to be a CSS class that we add. So let's jump right in here. And the body element. This is where we want to add that CSS class. Because once it's here, everything else on the page is inside of the body. So this can be a trigger in our CSS. In my CSS, anywhere inside here that I want to do something with this new class, I just have to say loaded. If that's the class I'm using, then what do you want to do to the header when the page is loaded? In my script, this is all we do. Window add event listener load. Once the page load event has happened, I'm going to go to the body element and I'm going to add the class loaded. So it's just like I came in here and I did this. I went class equals loaded. Once that's there, that's going to be the trigger in my CSS to do something slightly different. Okay, so this is being added after fonts, after CSS, after images, after scripts, after everything else is loaded. This class gets added to the body. So what are we going to do? In our CSS, as I was saying before, I want to make a change to this background image that we've got on our page over here. So we're going to use transform, and it's the scale property that we're going to apply this to. So let's say 140%. That's the change that we're going to make. And when the page is loaded, we're going to set this back to scale 1. So while it's loading, 1.4, 140%. When it's finished loading and that class gets added, we snap back to 1. Now, that's going to be an instantaneous change. We're not even going to really see this here. So we need to add a transition. It's the transform property right here. This is the thing that we're transitioning. So when we change from scale 1.4 to 1, that's when we make this change. We'll say it's going to take a half second. We'll make it ease in, so it starts slow and gets faster. And then I'm going to add a delay of 0.5 seconds. So even if the image is cached and it loads immediately, there's going to be a half-second delay before this thing kicks in. So let's reload the page. Okay, so that's the effect. But I don't want this heading to be affected. I don't want everything inside the header to be affected. I just want the image. So somehow we need to separate the image right here for the background from this H1. In the HTML, what I could do is I could add a div inside of here and be the div that's transforming, and then the H1 doesn't transform. But why not just use the pseudo element before? So we can say the header has the before element, and that's the thing that's going to scale. So let's do that. Inside here, we'll say header before, and this is going to be the header before that gets changed, the scaling, and we're going to move all the stuff about the background image. I'm going to take all that, and we're going to move it down into here. So header before. Now, just doing that, I lose my background image. Because in the before, you have to actually have some content and define the size and how big it's going to be and all that. So the header, we're going to say is position relative. And that's going to allow us to position absolute to position this piece of content relative to the header itself. So wherever the top corner of the header is, that's where the top corner of this image is going to go as well. And its content, it's just going to be an empty string. There's no visible content. And we can set the width to 100% of the viewport. And the height is going to be 100% of the viewport height. Okay, the image is now the correct size. When I resize this, yeah, it's still working. Everything's good. My only issue is I've lost all my content. When I scroll down the page, the rest of it's there, but my heading, and it's because of position absolute. This image was removed from the page, that H1 was added, and then this was added back on top. So to fix that, what we have to do is come in here and say z-index -1. Put it behind the other content inside of its parent. There we are. So now, this all works. Our rule of thirds, our golden ratio has been applied, all these things. And we've got this animation that now takes place on just the before element. Because we changed this to say header before when this is added to the body. That's when we go from the 1.4 to the 1. Now you can change the numbers, how long it's going to take. You can change the scaling. You could say, oh, I want this thing to be really massive. So a really sudden change from 240% down to 100%. Something like that. Whatever the sizes that you want to use, you can play around with those numbers. But again, we're adding some visual interest to the page. And all we had to do was move the background image from the header to a pseudo class, pseudo element. And in the JavaScript, we added this class to the body. And that's the trigger. When the page is loaded, add this class. All right, last thing. We want to use some CSS variables, and we want to control them from JavaScript. In my JavaScript right now, I'm getting my root element. That's the document element, so that is like the HTML tag. I'm finding the h1 element inside of here. So I'm getting this h1. I'm getting the root, and I'm getting the length of this text. I don't know if you've noticed, but as I resize this, there is a slight change taking place in the size of the font. That text is adjusting slightly as I adjust the size of the page. And that is because in my CSS, right down here, my H1, I'm saying, okay, 2 rem, that's my base size for my font. And then I want to add 2% of the height and 2% of the width onto that. So we've got 2 rem as the base, and then we're adding to that. And that's great. But I want to do something that's a little bit more dynamic. I want to take into account how big this text is, how many characters there are inside of here. And we also want to make sure, with this, it's going to work fine with mobile, but we want to make sure that we're checking that all the time as well. So I'm going to come in here, and there we go. On mobile, this is working fine as well. So I'm not applying the rule of thirds when I'm on the mobile size. That's great. It's still being applied here. My font size, yep, that's still working with 2 lines of text. So that's all good. But I want to adjust this a little bit more with the variables. Now I have 2 variables that I added right here. And this is my scope. It's the root element. So it's my whole page. There's 2 variables, one base and one length. This is going to be my length of my title, and this is the one that I want to set when the page loads. So once I've got the content, the DOM content loaded, once I have the HTML, I'm going to look at the H1, find out how many characters are inside there, and I'm going to change this value. And I'm going to divide 10 by whatever this number is, and that's going to be the factor by which I change my font size. Now these are numbers that you can play around with later on, but for now we're going to start with these 2 base numbers. So we're going to say, we're going to multiply whatever this value is for the font. We're going to multiply it by, like I said, we're taking that base number and we're going to divide that by whatever the length is. So right now, base and len are both 10. So I save this, no change at all. This is the same size because we're multiplying this value by 1. So there's no change. But I want to be able to add more text in here and have the font size adjust as well. So the more text there is, the smaller it gets. So we need to do this. We're going to take this number, whatever that length is, and that's going to be the value that we set inside of here. So the root element, we're going to set its style, go to its style property rather, and we're going to call the set property method. And the property that we're going to set is len, --len. This is the length variable that we have right here. So we're changing this thing. So we provide a name and we provide a value. Here's the name, and the value is going to be this variable right here, which is the length of whatever text is inside the H1. So this gets smaller. And now, every time I change this, we should be able to see an adjustment to that font size. So one word, it's big. 2 words, it's smaller. 3, it's even smaller. And every time we add more, the font size gets smaller and smaller and smaller. There we go. Okay, now you can play with this, you can adjust this, you can fiddle with the numbers, make whatever you want the base to be the base. You can edit this formula, you can change the percentages for the height and width, you can change whether you're dividing or multiplying here. But this is all we need to do in order to set one of those variables. And this is our trigger. Once our HTML has loaded, we're going to read how big the title is, get that number, the length of characters, and then put that into the CSS so it can be used with calc to calculate some dimension. All right, and there it is. Some things that you can do. Rule of thirds, golden ratio, animated header images, and setting CSS variables from JavaScript. All those to just add some visual interest to your web pages. So I hope that helps you out. Have fun with that. Once again, all the content that I've used in this video is linked to down in the description. If you have questions, feel free to ask. I'll answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.